podcast is brought to you by LMU Munich.
All right, so apparently the theme for this afternoon is methodology, and I'm going to sort of continue that. I'll be going over ground that we had covered in the last two talks, not always the same way and not always with the same conclusions, but all right. All right, so let's begin with Tarski's famous, in the popularization in 1944 paper, he writes, so he's giving the ingredients that led to the liar paradox. We have implicitly assumed that the languages in which the antinomy is constructed contains, in addition to its expressions, also the names of these expressions, as well as semantic terms such as the term true. Referring to sentences of this language, we have also assumed that all sentences which determine the adequate usage of this term can be asserted in the language. A language with these properties will be called semantically closed. That's one. Two, we've assumed that in this language the ordinary laws of logic hold. And three, we've assumed that we can formulate and assert in our language an empirical premise such as the liar sentence that he refers to, which has occurred in our argument. Now he notes that, all right. So by sentences in the language, which determine the adequate usage of the word true, Tarski means the T-scheme, or the instances of it, rather. And by the ordinary laws of logic, he means what we're calling classical logic. Now, he notes that the empirical element in condition 3 isn't really essential, and what's needed, or at least what's used, is self-reference. And of course, we all know that, and he knew, and everyone knew then, or the logicians knew, that any language that can express a modicum of arithmetic has the resources for self-reference, so we don't really need condition 3. And then he writes, the assumptions 1 and 2 prove essential. Since every language which satisfies both of these assumptions is inconsistent, we must reject at least one of them. All right. Now, the same options hold today. So any theorist who wants to employ something recognizable as a truth predicate in a systematic or, not necessarily consistent, as we know, but non-trivial way, has to either restrict the T-scheme or in the corresponding T-rules or inner substitutivity or whatever, or propose a non-classical and, of course, non-intuitionistic logic. All right. Tarski, of course, goes the first route, right, for those two. So he says it would be superfluous, I love this, to stress the consequences of rejecting assumption 2. Right? That is changing our logic, supposing this were possible, right? Even in its more elementary and fundamental parts. We'll get to what he might have meant in a while. We thus consider only the possibility of rejecting assumption 1. Accordingly, we decide not to use any language which is semantically closed in the sense given. All right. Now, of course, there's a large sample of work, so as I say in the written paper, that was then, this is now. It's the title of a movie, I think. And now, since then, there's been a whole lot of work, an explosion of work that goes the other route. So I have my 4 examples here, but we could have added the ones that we heard even talks on this even here. I have Graham's in contradiction, J.C. Beale, Alan Weir, and Hartree-Field. All right, now, one way to look at this, it's a sort of optimization project. Look at all the work, right? You start with the obvious truth that classical logic is incompatible with the instances of the T-scheme, and so you got to give up something. And the idea is to do it in a way that gives you as rich and powerful a theory as possible, of course, short of triviality. I mean, that's a really powerful theory, but you don't want it to be that powerful, right? As, in another context, as Penn Maddie once put it, she wasn't talking about truth, but we want to operate one step back from disaster. I want to sort of, all right. Now, the purpose of this talk, this paper, is to explore the theses that might be claimed on behalf of those proposed alternate. So I want to ask, what's being claimed or what might be claimed? I don't want to necessarily ask what is claimed, but what might be claimed on behalf of those who propose an alternative non-classical logic in response to the semantic paradoxes, or for that matter, in response to anything. Right? So what's being claimed when somebody puts forward a different logic than the ones we're used to? What exactly are they proposing, or should they be proposing concerning their favored logic, whatever it is? Now, you can ask parallel questions, and we will, about the other more traditional group of theorists, those who keep the logic alone, leave the logic alone, and restrict the T-scheme. what can be claimed by such theorists, or should be claimed by such theorists, on behalf of their account of truth vis-a-vis the ordinary intuitive pre-theoretic conception. Okay. So option 1, description. Right? All right. So to pick a neutral term, so we'll start with the logic revision batch first. So the theorists who work in this genre, no, everybody. So the theorists who work in this genre, not just the people who monkey around with the logic, Tarski, Priest, Weir, Beale, Field, Gupta, Belknap, Kripke, everybody, right, who works in truth. What they deliver are various theories of truth. Of course, we heard that word already today in the 2 previous talks. So perhaps we should think of the word theory here in the sense of a theory of, say, thermodynamics. So the idea is that each author is presenting a description of the ordinary pre-theoretic notion of truth, maybe something like the results of a conceptual analysis or a semantic theory. Right? They're just telling us what they think truth is, a theory of that. Now, for our revisionists in the group, the account of truth is about as simple as can be. I mean, the account of truth is, right? It's just, intersubstitutivity or the T-scheme or, whatever, right? The action there, of course, concerns the logic. Right? Now, if the underlying logic of natural language is classical, now I did say if. Of course, we don't know what if means, but anyone who deploys the ordinary notion of truth according to these constitutive principles is saddled with inconsistency and probably even triviality. Or, no, not probably, and triviality, right? So if the underlying logic is classical, and if we are going to actually adopt and deploy, and do actually adopt and deploy the unrestricted T-scheme, then everything's trivial. It blows up. Some philosophers are kind of content to leave things like that, suggesting that the inconsistent notion, or they might give ways in which the inconsistent notion can still be deployed in a useful manner, right? But don't sort of feel any big need to get beyond it. All right. But now, what of the logic, or at least of those who want to tinker with the logic? All right. Now, here we can invoke the word theory, too. I mean, Graham did, right, invoke the word theory of logic, thinking of logic as a theory of, well, of validity, or logical consequence, or and logical consequence. Now, should we also understand this in the sense of a theory of thermodynamics? That is, could each author be claiming or that his theory is getting it right, describing the one true notion of consequence or validity, right? So there is just one notion, and here's my theory of it. If so, then what is it that the theory is supposed to be getting right? What is validity? So we talked about that already today, and we will some more. All right, now, unlike thermodynamics, the target of logic, right, validity, is itself normative in some sense of normative. Logicians are, as Graham emphasized, are not out to describe how speakers, even careful speakers, actually reason, but how they ought to reason, or how they ought to regulate their system of beliefs, putting the Harmon point on the table and then acknowledging it and then moving beyond it. Nevertheless, from our first perspective, logic is still going to be a descriptive enterprise. It's descriptive of a normative thing. So the logician is out to describe what follows from what. So their targets are the norms implicit in rational beings as such in our community of reasoners. Right? So that's the first option. It's descriptive, and it's describing something like that. Now, at least one of our authors, I mean, the 4 on my list. Again, I won't speak for the rest of them, but at least one, namely Graham, actually does make a descriptive claim. I mean, at least if I'm reading it right. He says that both that his dialethic account accurately describes the notion of truth, and that the one true notion of logical consequence is paraconsistent. Right? So there is one notion, and it may not be LP because we may not have it exactly right, but whatever it is, it's paraconsistent. Now, Field doesn't join him in making that claim. Well, I mean, the analogous claim. That the one true logic is paracomplete. He never claims that his notion of consequence is and always has been the one we implicitly deploy, unbeknownst to many generations of logicians. So he's not claiming that, well, we've been getting it wrong and now here it is. Now, what he is claiming, don't know. I ask him, and then we talk about it for a while, and then I kind of wonder what it is that he told me, and right. Now, I suggest that Graham notwithstanding, it's very difficult to sustain a descriptive claim on behalf of a logic brought to resolve the semantic paradoxes. And here's why. The issues are subtle and deep, and I have to limit myself to a sketch here. All right, now it's widely held that validity, whatever validity is, it flows somehow from the meaning of the logical terminology. Words and phrases like or, it is not the case that, for all, at least when those words are used in a certain way in deductive reasoning. Meaning now is the sort of thing that is grasped, at least tacitly, by competent speakers of a language, or ordinary competent deductive reasoners in the case at hand. So just say professional math, anyone who's regularly does long sustained deductive reasoning. Plausibly, meaning is the sort of thing that speakers grasp implicitly when they understand a language. Just as, not exactly evidence here for this, but for support, Dummett argues that a competent speaker of a language must be able to manifest understanding of its logical terminology. That's his phrase, manifest. Now, model theorists think of meaning as given by truth conditions. So on the picture that I'm trying to sketch here, someone competent with the language should grasp the truth conditions, at least implicitly. Obviously, they're not in a position to state them, but this is, the situation isn't a whole lot different than any other semantic enterprise. And on such views, the relation of validity is tied to those truth conditions. And of course, proof theorists argue that the meaning is given by inference rules, and competent speakers must somehow implicitly or tacitly grasp those, whatever that means. But in the same sense that the competent speakers could grasp meaning at all. So a descriptive theory of logic has some more or less empirical consequences. More or less, that is, no more and no less than anything else in linguistics. If competent speakers, or at least professional mathematicians and scientists, are somehow implicitly onto the one true notion of logical consequence, because they're onto the meanings of the logical terms, then it might be argued there should be a characterization of this notion that can be tested against the considered verdicts of competent reasoners concerning at least many arguments. Now, realize that the tests are always, there aren't going to be, I realize things aren't as simple as this. There's always going to be room to maneuver. There's suppressed premises, there's presupposition, competence, performance, all kinds of things to deal with. But in that respect, logic isn't different from other linguistic enterprises. The data would be felt entailments and judgments of felicity by those recognized as competent reasoners just as much as in a lot of linguistics. Now, to be sure, the data is theory-laden, as I said, and no one pronouncement is sacrosanct, but of course this isn't different than any other linguistic enterprise. All right. Now, it seems to me that in the case of our truth theorists who are proposing alternate logics, the empirical theses are implausible. The logics they propose are quite subtle, well, at least some of them are quite subtle. And as noted, the trick in this enterprise, of the theory enterprise, is to avoid contradiction or to avoid triviality, while leaving as much of the entire logico-semantic enterprise as powerful as possible. So a theorist who makes a descriptive claim about logic would have to maintain that ordinary speakers, or at least ordinary folk who engage in chains of deductive reasoning, say professional mathematicians, are somehow implicitly competent in the subtle restrictions proposed in order to avoid paradox. They'd have to claim that when push comes to shove, ordinary reasoners will reject exactly the classically valid inferences that the favored logic declares to be invalid. For example, if someone were to make a descriptive claim on behalf of Field's logic, then she'd be claiming that ordinary reasoners are somehow aware at some level, tacitly aware, that they should not invoke an instance of excluded middle if there's some reason to think that the embedded sentence is indeterminate, right, in Field's technical sense. And similarly for the others. Now, against this, it seems to me that ordinary competent reasoners, or even ordinary celebrated deductive reasoners, are ignorant of the subtle restrictions needed to avoid triviality. For the overwhelming most part, the threat of paradox due to the semantic paradox is simply not on the deductive reasoner's radar, and the underlying logic they invoke is not equipped to deal with it. Now, what I'm calling these sort of I didn't use the word quasi-empirical yet, but what I'm calling these sort of empirical, quasi-empirical themes are in fact pursued from the camp of relevance logicians, at least some of them. some of whom do pay attention to verdicts or intuitions concerning validity and invalidity. But the common relevance logics, that is, those that are developed by focusing on felt entailments and felt non-entailments, don't work for paradox. At least I don't think they do, or at least as far as I know they don't. We don't get to a logic that's safe from paradox just by paying attention to patterns of inference and judgments of validity and invalidity among competent reasoners. Now, of course, we can ask the same, all right, so the question that I'm asking now, or the attitude that I'm taking towards a descriptive theory of logic, we'll move on to consider another option in a minute, but for the descriptive one, we can ask that about the other class of truth theorists, that is, those that leave the logic alone and monkey around with the truth scheme. Tversky's own theory is the prime example, so we can ask, well, what's he claiming? Now, he sort of says what he's claiming, right? But it's not a descriptive one. He explicitly says that he's not out to get everything that is right about the ordinary use of the word true. Now, what he is claiming, well, we'll get to that. All right. So anyway, that's part one. That was the descriptive. Now, second interpretive move, or second thing that might be claimed on behalf of the either the truth side of it or the logic side of it, depending on which one is the one that's more revisionary, is a prescriptive orientation. Now, this is an example to motivate it. It's well known that typical intuitionists concede that mathematicians generally accept the law of excluded middle, double negation, elimination, and so on, in the sense that those principles are implicit in deductive practice. That is, intuitionists don't dispute the descriptive matter broached in the section before, nor are they interested in that. They say, look, I'm just not interested in trying to figure out what even correct reasoning is in this sort of internal sense of correct in the mathematical community or whatever, in the community of reasoners. Instead, the intuitionist argues that we ought to demur from the disputed principles, from excluded middle. They claim that our current inferential practice is broken and it needs to be fixed. I mean, of course, each one will give you a different reason as to why it's broken and why it needs to be fixed. But they concede, or they seem to concede, that the descriptive theory, they don't have to concede that the classicist has that right, but whatever it is, right, that isn't what they're up to. So an analogous theme here would start with the concession that the logic proposed by one of the authors, the four that I've chosen, or Elio, or whatever, right, is not implicit in our normative deductive practice to date. Right? That would be the first concession to make. Okay, descriptive claim, that's not it. Our theorists would insist, though, that because of the semantic paradoxes, we ought to stop using that logic in the sense that we should stop reasoning according to its norms and start using the norms from his or her proposed logic instead. Right? Stop doing it that way, start doing it this way. Right? You can usually tell when I get to a page that's numbered by, that's congruent to 0 mod 4, right, in the slides, right? Because of this habit I have of sort of giving out the slides. All right, so the theme raised and examined in the section before is that we need a new theory of logic because our current theories are descriptively inadequate, one might claim. The present theme is that what we need instead is a new logic. Better ways to reason, better deductively, better ways to evaluate deductive reasoning, better ways to regulate and organize our beliefs for inconsistency. Right? Indeed, we need a new what we need is a new conception of what should count as consistent. So it'd be a call to arms for revolution, right? To put it. All right. Now recall what Tversky wrote. So this is the in 1944 in the Semantic Conception of Truth paper. It would be superfluous to stress here the consequences of rejecting assumption 2, that is, of changing our logic, supposing this were possible, even in its more elementary and fundamental parts. Now, I'm kind of wondering what he meant by supposing this were possible. Right? So what is he asking us to suppose is, well, what is he probably asking us to suppose is not possible? You know, with the, all right. Now, one option, I don't think I get into this in the, all right. So one option is that we could change, he's saying, look, we really can't change our theory of logic, you know, along the lines of the first option, but that would be kind of silly. Of course we can change that. We have, and you know, and he certainly was aware that that different theories have been around and so on. He might be making a claim that the theory is really deeply entrenched and well confirmed, whatever that means, and look for the fix elsewhere. Or he might be wondering whether we could be changing the logic itself, right? Whether that's possible. Now, he certainly would have been aware of, in 1944, of the major, not necessarily the work, of course, on truth after that, but he would have been aware of the intuitionist, so he certainly would have been aware of claims that the reasoning is broken and needs to be fixed. But maybe he's just sort of just dismissing those as, well, that's just a non-starter. All right. Now, among the authors that I used to sort of I used to mix Alan Weir in with the descriptivist, but he kind of reminded me of a passage he wrote, which I was embarrassed that I didn't immediately have in the front of my mind, which actually sounds the revolutionary theme. All right, so here's Weir's, I think it's from the naive set theory paper, yeah. Certainly to add restrictions on transitivity is a radical move, and one which would have to be made in a controlled fashion. All right, sure. Surely such restrictions could not plausibly be thought of as implicit in our actual practice of inference. Rather, they can only be revisions of that practice, revisions motivated by a desire to make better sense of it overall in light of the difficulties we seem to land ourselves in, whichever way we turn when reasoning about sets and semantics. And perhaps also in other areas, sorieties and so on. All right. So now, any revisionist, if any of our theorists wants to go down this route, that is the prescriptive revolutionary route, they could soften the blow by pointing out that after the revolution we can maintain some semblance of our prior practice, and then of course it would depend on the details of it. If there's no danger of paradox in Field's case, then you can assume excluded middle as a non-logical principle. Of course, the intuitionists wouldn't say that if there's no threat of paradox, but or reason classically if there's no threat of inconsistency, and so on. All right. Even so, right, even with the sort of the blow softened a bit, the revisionist proposals carry costs. I mean, presumably, time do we start? Where's my chair? What time do we start? I mean, what time should I be looking to wrap up is what I should say.
6.
That's when.
Started at 5:15.
Oh, no, I don't want to go till 6:15. No, I'm thinking 6:30 is when we want to end. All right. So, well, okay. So I'll try to, all right. All right, so the revisionist proposal carries costs. Presumably, the proposal would involve a suggestion that we revise our logic texts and classes accordingly. Even, Graham had suggested that with the logic we teach, right? So if we decide that we got the logic itself wrong, right, then presumably we need to start teaching the new one, the right one, the one we're going to use instead. So if Field's logic is the one we all ought to adopt, then those of us charged with teaching logic should be teaching that logic. And similarly for the other proposals, if one of those is going to win instead. And of course, it isn't just that. Referees for professional journals in, say, linguistics have to be trained in the new logic so that they can assess arguments accordingly, especially when unrestricted notions of truth and truth conditions are involved. That's why I sort of threw linguistics in. Most of the time you might think, oh yeah, but you don't need to worry about this in math because, at least in the sort of contemporary classical mathematics, because there's no threat of paradox there, let them go on reason classically. But in areas where, you are sort of looking to be grandiose and have truth conditions for everything, then be more careful. All right, now, before making the revisions, however they're understood and however far they go, we need to see what other options are. Are there other less drastic ways, costly ways to confront the possibility of paradox and revenge? And of course, we'd have to evaluate the revisionist proposals against each other to see which one to adopt. So I'm not quite sure how this is supposed to end up. Like we're supposed to have like this big meeting and sort of decide on, which one is the best one, and then, and then revise the curriculum and get everyone to start teaching that and so on. All right. Now, before going after logic, maybe there are other less drastic or revolutionary options to consider. So you might maintain the old logic, whatever it is, let's assume it's classical, and then revise what you take to hold of truth. That is, we can sort of go down the revolutionary or prescriptive line with the truth theory too, right? We could say, okay, something's broken here. Let's change what we're going to do with truth. And of course, one natural and of course hardly original thought along those lines would be to restrict the T-scheme, on Tarskian lines. But then, of course, you wouldn't be able to use it as freely as you used to, and be careful, and you have the Nixon-Dean debates and things like that. As a matter of fact, you can take all of the proposals in the literature and interpret them in this way. That is, whether they're revising the logic or they're telling us something about truth, you could think of them in this sort of revisionist spirit. You might think of replacing the unrestricted freewheeling truth predicate with a context-sensitive one, or with one governed by a rule of revision, a la Gupta Belknap, or whatever. Another option can be considered is not to revise anything. I call this the Alfred E. Newman move. Just leave it all alone. Like as Chihara once put it, perhaps the cure is worse than the disease. All right, now when it comes to logic, the revisionist situation is actually a little worse than in the case of revising truth. Because, I mean, as Field points out, that in, well, maybe this isn't quite as strong as he makes it, but something close to it, that in just about any language that has an unrestricted truth predicate with certain intuitive features, depending on what the logic is like, you can't coherently maintain that valid arguments are truth-preserving because of the Curry paradox. I mean, there are options here. Actually, we heard a couple yesterday about if the logic isn't transitive, then maybe the result doesn't hold. But you know, at least for a lot of the logics on the table, it does. You can't maintain that valid arguments are truth-preserving. So what this means is that you have the revolutionary proposals in logic call for revising our conceptual scheme, and not just how we're going to reason and just, right, as if that's not enough, how we're going to reason and regulate our beliefs for consistency. They require us to rethink what the very target of logical study is. I mean, what is it that our logics are out to capture? What is it for an argument to be valid? Intuitively, right, the answer is necessary truth-preserving, right? But it turns out you can't say that, at least on many of the logics. You can't say that. All right, so that's option 2. Now, moving on to the third one, then last one. Living and working on the ship of Neurath. Maybe it's explication or sharpening or something like that. Maybe that's what's going on. So the clash between the descriptive and prescriptive perspectives on logic, despite the fact that I elaborated them so much, that's really something of a false dilemma. As noted, the target of the descriptive claim, right? So if you're going to make a descriptive claim about logic, that this theory is getting it right, the it that it's getting right has normative elements in it. Perhaps there's no sharp distinction. I'm not saying there's no distinction. Perhaps there's no sharp distinction and no distinction in kind between changing a descriptive theory of a normative practice, which is really what we're talking about here, and changing the practice itself. This is especially plausible in cases like logic, since we sometimes use the prevailing theory of the practice to check inferences and thus guide the very practice it's supposed to be describing. Right? Or at least we logicians tend to like to think that. You know, somebody wants to know if the logic's okay, well, ask us, we'll tell them, right, if their reasoning's okay. All right, now for a very rough analogy, no linguist that I've tried this on thinks that I'm even close to right about this. Consider the enterprise of composing a dictionary, and just think about word spelling. All right, now spelling is normative. That's the part that the linguists I've talked to don't like, in the sense that the focus is on correct spelling, right? That's what the dictionary is supposed to get at. Nevertheless, in some sense, the practice is paramount. The way that most people, or most of the right kind of people, the cool people, actually spell words, most of the time, determines how they should be spelled. Right? So at first, the lexicographer's job, the dictionary maker's job, is straightforwardly descriptive. She's out to codify, systematize, and present the norms implicit in a linguistic community concerning word spelling. Right? At some point, though, the community starts to use, or might start to use, an established dictionary to check spelling, and thus to guide the very practice the lexicographer is out to describe. Eventually, the dictionary can become something close to a court of final appeal in such matters. Putting aside that, you know, you've got different dictionaries that don't always agree, you know, as to how words can be spelled and so on. Now, at some point, at that point, or sometime after that, the dictionary somehow becomes constitutive of correct spelling. Think of sort of how it's supposed to work, like if you're playing Scrabble, right, and you get into a argument. Oh, no, you spelled that wrong. No, I got it right. No, you got it wrong. Okay, let's check. Right? All right, where do you check? Right? You look in the dictionary. So at some point, the perspective shifts from Socrates. You know, the dictionary is describing it, right? It's spelled that way. It isn't in the dictionary because it's spelled that way. It's the other way around, right? To that of Euthyphro, right? That is, no, this is the way it should be spelled because it's in the dictionary. All right. Now, another example is grammar, although that seems to be bound up with semantics and even pragmatics, but surely it's correct to say that use determines syntax. Grammarian seems to propose something like this. Since they rely on judgments of ordinary speakers, so sort of informants to test their theories, they're not assuming that speakers have the concept of grammar, and they don't ask them that, but they ask them, would this be an okay thing to say? Now, if they say no, there could be for all kinds of reasons, and this is where your theory is going to kick in. But still, right, that's the data. Is this sort of thing okay to say? Now, notice that a well-constructed theory of grammar, once it's generally accepted, can be used to adjudicate manners of correct grammar, say by copy editors for journals and publishing houses, not to mention school teachers. Right? All right, now to be sure, I'm running over many delicate issues here concerning an important distinction between how speakers actually deploy their language, how they think the language should be deployed, and how they were taught it should be deployed. Right? School teachers and copy editors have been known to accept on, insist on, and even enforce bad theories of what the grammar is. I mean, one of my big hobby horses are the copy editors at Oxford, who I keep running up against, who keep telling me I can't split my infinitives. Right? I mean, I think they're just wrong about that. Right? But on the other hand, they're the boss. Right? They're the ones that are going to publish the book. All right. So my point here, though, is a mild one. Right? That is, I realize there's a lot going on here, it isn't as straightforward as there's a crucial experiment or anything like that. But the mild point is that a good theory of grammar can sometimes and in some way guide the very practice it was designed to describe. Now, presumably something like that, but surely more complex, holds for semantics as well. Right? And with semantics, it seems we're not very far from logical consequence and validity, at least on some accounts of logical consequence and validity. All right. Now, there are a number of philosophical perspectives on language that dovetail nicely with the idea that there's no distinction in kind between changing a descriptive theory of a normative practice and changing the practice itself. Again, I'm not saying there's no distinction, but it's a blurry one. Some of these perspectives involve an outright rejection of what Mark Wilson calls the classical picture, the thesis that the concepts we deploy are precisely delimited in all possible directions. The opposing claim, or one opposing claim, is that there's genuine indeterminacy concerning the proper usage to date of many concepts, or perhaps better, what's essential to words and what they stand for. To put it crudely, the underlying theme here is that ordinary language and ordinary notions and ordinary reasoning are fraught with vagueness, loose rules, defeasible rules of thumb, just about everywhere. It's not that anything goes, right? That's crazy, right? We do manage to reason, we do manage to get things right, right? But it isn't as sharp and determinate as one would hope. All right, now the perspective that I'm suggesting here, or outlining or sketching, is of a piece with the Quinian attack on the analytic-synthetic distinction. But I think it's even more consonant with Weismann's notion of open texture. Now, people have started implicitly, well, complaining isn't the right word, but they keep asking me, am I going to talk about Weismann again every time I give a talk? Not always, but, I mean, yeah, here, right? But, Weismann has really become one of my two heroes in philosophy of language, so I keep sort of bringing it up whenever I can. The other one is Lewis Carroll. But anyway, the notion of open texture, which for Weismann dates back to his 1945 paper, only considers empirical terms in ordinary language, but the idea can be, and I think should be, extended well beyond that. So here's the idea. Let P be a predicate from natural language. So according to Weismann, P exhibits open texture if there are possible objects P such that nothing in the established use of P, no, I'm not doing too good on time, or the non-linguistic facts determines that P holds a P or that P fails to hold. In effect, the sentence P of P is, I shouldn't have used the same, if I realized, if I sort of had in mind I was going to be giving this as a talk, I wouldn't have used the same letter, right? Is left open by the use of language to date. All right. Now, yeah, so I have one of the thought experiments he uses to characterize the notion, but I'll skip over that. What's kind of curious, he uses two main examples. One of them is this one, the word cat. You might think that it's sort of one common reaction I've gotten, and that a lot of philosophers have, is that, yeah, maybe he's right about ordinary words, but the one exception is going to be natural kind terms. And it is rather interesting that his other example is actually what is widely regarded as a natural kind term, namely gold. All right. But the idea is that language users introduce empirical terms to apply to certain kinds of objects in certain kinds. And of course, they're supposed to fail to apply to certain kinds of objects and other kinds. or other kinds of objects. But no matter how, the idea is no matter how a term gets introduced and acquires an established use and a meaning, we can never be sure that every possible situation is covered, one way or another. And the last observation is the key. The last observation in the quote is the key. Well, since I didn't read the quote, where is it? Yeah. The fact that in many cases there is no such thing as a conclusive verification. All right, the target of the Weismann paper was crude verificationism, but he realized that the idea is more far-reaching than that. The fact that in many cases there is no such thing as a conclusive verification is connected to the fact that most of our empirical concepts are not delimited in all possible directions. All right. That's the main idea. Now, sometimes when unexpected cases arise, we have to improvise. We have to sort of extend one way or another. We have to extend the language to cover these things one way or another, and that's what sort of open texture would predict. All right. Now the phrase open texture doesn't appear in Weismann's treatment of the analytic-synthetic distinction in a lengthy article. I don't know whether to call this one article or several. It published serially in Analysis, so there's 6 of them from 1949 to 1953. Every one of them ends up with to be continued, so you sort of think it should be a series. The last one also ends that way, by the way, right? So apparently, we weren't supposed to have gotten the end of it, but as far as, I don't think there are anymore. All right, so the notion of open texture doesn't appear there, but a very closely related notion plays a key role there. All right, so now no one, I think, denies that a natural language like English is an evolving phenomenon. As new situations are encountered and as new scientific theories develop, the extensions of predicates change. Now, sometimes the predicates become sharper, which of course is what open texture would predict. As new situations come up, as new cases come up, the predicate will get extended to apply to it, which one way or another, and didn't before. He also argues that when things like that happen, and we'll look at other things too besides open texture in a minute, but there is no point in, he says there is often no need to decide and no point in deciding whether the application of a given predicate to a novel case represents a change in its meaning or a discovery concerning the application of a term's old meaning. All right? So you can always ask that. Well, look, are we just going on as before, or are we introducing a new word which has a slightly different extension than the old word? He says most of the time that's not an interesting question to ask. There's no point in asking it. The contrary thesis, there's something like the one and only one way to go on. That's the thesis that Mark Wilson calls the classical picture, and that misrepresents the nature of language. So there's another quote there. Concerning the ordinary use of a term, the whole is naive. It's a word that we've been using a lot, naive, right? Good thing, naive, right? The whole picture is in a state of flux. One must indeed be blind not to see that there is something unsettled about language, that it is a living and growing thing, adapting itself to new sorts of situations, groping for new sorts of expression, forever changing. All right. Now, toward the end of the series, he writes, what lies at the root of this is something of great significance. The fact, namely, that language is never complete for the expression of all ideas. On the contrary, that it has an essential openness. Now, in the Analysis series, he points out that the dynamic nature of language goes well beyond what we were calling open texture. Sometimes there are outright changes in the application of various words and expressions. He argues, and I think his examples are rather intriguing, that advances in science often demand revisions in the accepted uses of common words. For the scientist, the revolutionary scientist, breaking away from the norm, that is, the linguistic norm, is sometimes the only way of making oneself understood. He illustrates this, I think, really nicely and in some detail with the notion of simultaneity in words like before and after in light of relativity. Right? That the English word simultaneous, or the German word, doesn't have a placeholder in it for a frame of reference. Right? So for Einstein to be able to say give the theory, he had to violate the established use of the word. People understood it eventually and got it, right? And well, in this case, you don't want to say that there's a change in meaning, but in other cases, you probably do. All right. So according to Weismann, there's often no need and no reason to decide what counts as a change in meaning and what counts as the extension of an old meaning to a new case. All right. So he said in an earlier installment in the series that there are no precise rules governing the use of words like time, pain, and so on, and that consequently to speak of the meaning of a word and to ask whether it has or has not changed meaning is to operate with too blurred of an expression. I take the too blurred expression here to be something like has the same meaning as. And we're encountering borderline cases or open cases of that relation. All right. Now, I want to say that the same thing goes for logic. Or indeed the extensions and meanings of the logical terms. There is simply no such thing as the logical norms employed in ordinary deductive reasoning, especially if this is a point that Graham emphasized this morning, or not this morning, after lunch, that especially if the reasoning is supposed to include more than just the pure mathematics in the more straightforwardly formalized theories of the last few decades, well, last century. Field also says something along these lines too. All right, now the same goes for the extension and meaning of the word true. It's not a case of open texture, right, in the sense that we found cases that, well, maybe it is, but it's not only that. That is, you might think of it as a case of open texture with the truth teller. You know, we come across a word that, a sentence rather, that doesn't seem to fit, right, one way or another, right, into the thing, right, but we also came across situations where our previous usage is pulling us in opposite directions. So we end up with open cases and conflicting cases. So in a certain sense, it's the opposite of open texture. Open texture, when you come to a case, you don't know what to do. In the case of truth and other inconsistent notions, you find out that you do know what to do, but you're being pulled in both directions. Well, you don't know what to do because you're being pulled in opposite directions. All right, now, from this vantage point, we could think of all right, now let's go back to the logic revisions now, or the truth theories generally. We can think of the field, priest field, beer wheel, Ilya, whatever, all of them, right, as proposals for sharpening both the ordinary notion of truth and the norms of reasoning in a way that avoids paradox and revenge, right? So it's sort of like a repair job. To invoke the usual metaphor, they're suggestions for tidying up the ship of Neurath. We don't have to ponder whether from the Weissmann point of view, we don't have to ponder whether the resulting notions are the same as or different from what their predecessors. A closely related, now this notion sounds an awful lot like, this idea of sharpening sounds an awful lot like the revisionary one, and it would have the same issues. If these are proposals that we all start using this notion, then it looks like you're going to have the same problems. That is, you're going to have to be revising a practice and somehow call a convention and take a big vote and change the textbooks and all that. But a closely related but different meta-theme is to think of each author as proposing a Carnap-Quine-style explication. That was raised earlier in conversation today, this notion, of the notions of truth and correct inference. So the picture is that each of them could be delivering or seen as delivering a more sharply delimited notion of truth along with a new logic and/or a new logic. And the notions of truth and the logic share many features of the partly inchoate ordinary notions they explicate. Now, if this is the idea, then the main claim of each project is that the introduced terms can do much of the legitimate work done by the previous notions, but in a more rigorous manner. Right? So again, just like any explication, right? This will do a lot of the work that the thing you're replacing is supposed to do. All right, now, what work? All right, now, well, before we get to that, but very briefly, you can sort of look at the other truth theories, too, as explications. You can look at, say, Tarski's work, which leaves the truth theory alone as, leaves the logic alone as an explication. Might look at Kripke as an explication, or Gupta-Belknap as an explication. So here's a notion of truth, and actually there's an awful lot in Tarski's own when he's describing his methodology that seems to fit this. He says, look, I don't care that much about natural language. Here's a notion that will work for some purposes. And he actually sort of tells us what the purposes are. Right? All right, now, if our theories of truth and logic are understood as proposals for sharpening the open texture or inconsistent concepts, then there might not be such a strong reason to settle on a winner, right? Which we would have in the case of sharpening, right? We need to, we should only be going on in one way as a community. But that would depend on each one being good for different purposes, and maybe the purposes are different. Now, what are the purposes? Oh, wait a minute. All right. So recall, this is the last slide, that a certain concept or word is supposed that, or the idea is that an explication is supposed to be as much like the original as possible, at least in a wide range of cases, but be more useful than the original for certain purposes. All right, so that doesn't carry the cost of a full-fledged revolution. But now it depends on, well, what are the purposes, right, of the proposed explication? If the purposes are more limited, then perhaps the cost can be borne. Right? Now, what are the purposes? Why do we want a consistent or at least non-trivial truth predicate? Well, I mean, Tarski has a reason for that, but I think it does admirably for that purpose. He wants to be able to calibrate the strength of various theories, and the truth theory does that. We want to know if one theory is stronger than another. Well, yeah, we could tell, at least we have one measure for it, if the first theory can define a truth predicate for the second, a Tarskian truth predicate for it. All right, so if we're thinking in terms of explication, we don't have to choose a winner, but it depends on what's being claimed on behalf of the candidates. At least in principle, the different explications might serve different purposes. But then it depends on what work truth is doing for us. Well, that's a big project, and and again, if I had another 2 hours, we could start on that, but we're out of time, and that's well beyond the scope of this paper. Right.